from where I sit, and Stormy too, and probably good evening for Peter.
Indeed.
So welcome to this session. The title of our session is New Issues in Global Trade and Investment, Practices and Reform Suggestions. This is a quite encompassing title for a session, so I expect we will range fairly widely, covering several issues, even though they'll be very related, no doubt, to one another. So challenges in international trade and investment relations have been mounting. This is hardly a controversial statement, with rising protectionism and the beginnings of a real breakdown in multilateral trade disciplines. In short, we have a non-trivial crisis in international cooperation. And it's been exacerbated by the calamitous collapse in production and trade as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This has resulted in huge challenges at the national level with spillovers onto the international scene. The danger of intensified protection rises as countries may be tempted to go it alone rather than seeking resilience through cooperation. And that is a very real challenge for the international community. As I think everybody knows, the institutional and policy challenges facing the trading system are immense. And just to name a few, the whole question of modernizing the trading system, multilaterally and regionally, to adapt to the virtual economy, involving digitalization, e-commerce, and tackling the digital divide. Adapting to the rise in services and an increasingly complex relationship between goods and services, both in production and in trade. Addressing sustainability, a rising challenge that's becoming increasingly center stage. Dealing with environment, climate change, how do those regimes match with the WTO? There are serious problems coming down the pike in terms of perceptions about this. And then there's, of course, the social sustainability as well, ensuring access and inclusion to the wide community of nations, and not just for the few. Managing relationships between multilateral and regional regimes, that's also a challenge for everybody. And then, of course, there are the specific difficulties facing the WTO as an institution, its dispute settlement system, decision-making arrangements involving issues around consensus and non-discrimination, rules on subsidies at the very heart of tensions among major trading countries. I could go on with my list, but I think we're going to get to some substance. I should also mention that the Think 20 task force, of which Peter here is a member, on trade, investment and growth during the Saudi G20 presidency, has been grappling with these issues, and they have produced some material which is quite relevant to some of the things that we're going to be discussing. So before we proceed, let me just quickly introduce the panelists. Dr. Stormy Mildner, who since 2014 has been head of the Department of External Economic Policy in the Federation of German Industries. She was also the B20 Sherpa during the 2017 German presidency of the G20. And prior to joining the German Industries Federation, she was a member of the executive board of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, a policy-oriented think tank based in Berlin. And her fields of interest there were trade, or included anyway, trade, finance, and commodity issues. Before joining the SWP, she worked for the German Council on Foreign Relations, where she headed the program on globalization in the world economy. She's also been associated with a variety of academic institutions over the years, both in Europe and in the United States. Peter Draper is currently Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade in the Faculty of Professions at the University of Adelaide. During the Saudi Arabia's G20 presidency, he is co-chair of the T20, as I mentioned a moment ago, his involvement. the Task Force 1, which is on trade, investment and growth. Mr. Draper holds a number of other posts, quite a long list. I'm probably going to truncate it a little bit. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Chamber of Commerce's Research Foundation. He's a non-resident fellow of the Brussels-based European Centre for International Political Economy. He's an associated researcher at the German Development Institute and a board member of the Australian Services Roundtable. For 10 years, he's been associated with the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on global trade and investment. A good part of his professional life has been spent in South Africa, including in the South African Institute for International Affairs, and before that in the Department of South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry. Professor Anwarul Hoda is a former civil servant. He joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1962 and worked in the Ministry of Commerce from 1974 to 81 in various positions. In 1991, he was appointed Deputy Director General of GATT, which then became the WTO in 1995. And he continued in that post until 1999. During some of that time, I should mention that he was my boss. I just saying that in passing, so I have to be careful. Part of his work was associated with negotiations on information technology. He was leading on that in the WTO when those issues appeared on the agenda, which eventually led to WTO's information technology agreement. He was also a specialist on tariff negotiations in the GATT and WTO, on which he wrote a book in 2001. This work remains a classic on the subject, and a second edition came out in 2018. From 2004 to 2009, he was a member of the Planning Commission, Government of India, in charge of international economic relations, transport, and urban infrastructure. And since 2009, he has been chair professor in trade policy at ICRIER. ICRIER, I think you say, ICRIER.
ICRIER, yes.
So with that, let's get on with the business at hand. Each of the panelists has 20 minutes. Please don't overshoot, because that will leave us time for Q&A. It's good to have some audience participation. So I urge you to stick to your 20 minutes. And with that, I hand over to Stormy.
Well, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure being here. I've known Peter for quite a while. I have read so many books and articles of Patrick that it feels like I know you really well too. And Rajat, it's really nice. And Anwarul, Professor Hoda, it's really nice to see you and get to know you today as well. And Patrick, if I overshoot in length, just interrupt me. Just go in and say, that's it. Very good. Because I know from my own moderations of such virtual panels, it's really hard to make eye contact to get somebody to stop. So thank you so much. The topic of our panel is pretty broad, looking at the challenges of the global trading system and the world economy as a whole. So what I wanted to do is identify a few trends and also ask the question if that is really something new, Corona related, or what the Corona crisis is doing. And then after those trends, which I'm definitely not going to cover all in their whole depth and broadness, I want to touch upon them a little bit. Then I want to ask 4 or 5 key questions, which I think we have to find an answer to. I don't have an answer to it, but maybe we get a little further in our panel discussion. And then also propose a little bit of a to-do list, also for the European Union, what we have to do. So with regard to the trends. The first trend, and here I have my industry head on, and I know from empirical evidence and from talking to companies, the global value chains are changing. And they are changing in some sectors pretty dramatically. And that already started before the Corona crisis. And there are factors which are good and factors which are bad, which are contributing to the global value chains changing. What is quite natural, they are changing because emerging economies play a different role now in the world economy, more production at home, lesser import of inputs and the other way around. Digitalization also plays a big role. Also the trade and services plays a big role for value chains in the industrial sector. But a factor which also led to changes, which is not a positive one, is government involvement, especially on the side of the United States and also China. And I'm not just referring to tariffs. We are a lot of times just looking at the tariffs, but what had a bigger impact are export controls, entity lists, dual use regulations, so very much in the technology realm. So what we are observing now, while we had quite a few companies which produced in the United States to export to China, they're not doing that so much anymore because you can't get the technology out of the country anymore. And that is, for example, also in the car sector and some other high-tech sectors. And companies are producing more in China for the Chinese market. So that is changing. Global value chains are changing. And that has been or is being accelerated by the Corona crisis. Companies are looking at their, obviously, at their supply chains. They're looking for vulnerabilities and they are trying to build up redundancies and they are looking at different suppliers. So that is changing because also another thing which is not possible right now anymore is just-in-time production. So there will be more stocks which are being built up and more reserves. And that is something which we can pretty much expect to continue in the future. The second trend, which also started before the Corona crisis, is the one of nationalism, go-it-alone strategies, and protectionism. After the last financial economic crisis, we saw a pretty steep increase on protectionist measures. And you know the figures, the WTO puts together a report repeatedly, a really good overview of where the new protectionist barriers are. And since the Corona crisis, we have seen new barriers, especially for exports, especially in the area of protective gear and medical equipment. And I have to say, and I'm sorry to say this, that Germany actually was one of the first countries which enacted such controls, restrictions, even in the internal market, which created quite a bit of problems in value chains, also in the EU and with our neighbors, and solidarity, just thinking about Italy, Spain, and so on. Fortunately, Germany, it became Europeanized. Then we had European export controls. It was a little better, but not really, because that created lots of problems in our global value chains, especially with the United States. So lots of German companies suddenly couldn't get the protective gear anymore they needed in their production in the United States because they got it through the production and distribution net in Germany. So that created a whole ton of problem. So the Corona crisis is accelerating protectionism and protectionist thinking. We have seen also since the last economic and financial crisis more state interventionism. And that again is accelerated by the crisis. And right now, rightly so, we do need those stimulus packages. But the big question is, how do we get out of this eventually again? For example, the aviation industries would not survive without the stability funds and subsidies. But eventually, we need to think about how we get out of this, so not to get into a subsidy tit-for-tat spiral, which we have seen in the aviation industry already in the past. So the fourth trend is, I would say, and I already referred to it a little bit on the side, that trade policy has become more and more in the thinking of many, a geopolitical tool to achieve many aims, which are not necessarily trade policy related. And so there is, I see it in the area of export controls, where you also have a new linkage to industry policy making. For example, in the US export control law, the new one, which was passed by Congress a couple of years ago, there's a specific mentioning of industry policy goals. So there is a meddling, I would say, or a mixing of policy instruments which previously didn't have so much to do with each other. I'm not saying that trade was not always about geopolitics as well. I mean, always, right? The European Union's FTAs definitely also had a political reach and goal, but it's becoming a lot more pronounced, I would say. The fifth trend is that I do see a decreasing support for trade and trade liberalization and FTAs, also not a new trend, but I would also argue that it's been accelerated by the corona crisis, because that national thinking and that me first or our security first, that has just become more dominant. So it's harder to find the support in the population to further liberalize markets. And I see it very clearly within the European Union when I'm looking at support for free trade agreements by many EU member states, France, for example, but also the Netherlands. Netherlands was one of the big supporters of free trade agreements, and they pretty much made a flip in the last couple of years. It's become a lot harder. Trend 6 is, and Patrick, you mentioned it, the crisis of multilateralism. Trade policy and agreements have become so much more transactional. They are a lot of times so much more about managed trade than rules-based and free trade. So I very much agree that the WTO is facing a severe crisis in all three pillars: the rulemaking, the market access, the transparency, monitoring pillar, as well as definitely the dispute settlement pillar. So I see it again in the European Union. I don't want to only point at the US, but in the discussions we are currently having, there is also transactional thinking in there. The European Parliament right now made a proposal for reforming our enforcement regulation, proposing that the EU should act before there is a panel report by the WTO in the first stage. That is something I really don't like, but it shows that there is a certain movement away from a multilateral rules-based system to a more transactional approach. The seventh trend is, and that's very much related, international cooperation has become so much more difficult because trust has eroded immensely. Predictability is really low. And I remember one of when I had the pleasure of discussing the Trump administration with their ambassador in Germany, and I asked him, what do you like most about Trump? Then he said, oh, his unpredictability, because he keeps everybody on his toes. But that might be right, but that is really a problem for negotiations. So what are the central questions coming out of this, where we need a decision, where we need a recalibration? And that is, I would say, the first one is, how much state do we want in our economies, and how much market? Is maybe the line changing a little bit, but that's something we need to decide. How much national and regional do we want, and how much global do we want with regard to our value chains? The third question, how much protection do we want to give ourselves, and how much openness do we want to have? And then the fourth one is, how transactional do we want to be? Or is it better to put all our eggs into the multilateralism rules-based basket? And the fifth one is, how much do we want to use trade policy to achieve other policy aims? And as I said, I don't have an answer to this, but I see it very clearly that these are the main questions currently asked in the European Union when we are thinking about a reform of the trade policy agenda, which is currently going on. The EU initiated that a couple of months ago. There are consultations going on right now. I proposed a white paper on subsidies in third markets. It proposed, as you know, a new policy instrument to adjust for carbon leakage problems, the border adjustment mechanism. So there is a lot going on in the EU, and there are different views, obviously, between the member states with regard to those 5 questions. If I had my say, what I would like to see is that we first of all start to rebuild trust and predictability in all our global governance fora and actually talk to each other again. And then first put all our efforts into a reform of the WTO not just talk about the appellate body, but really look at the rules, because I think that is the underlying problem, and also the issue of development country status. So really work on the multilateral level, and then also look at our free trade agreements, if they do not have to be designed in a different way than in the past few years, to ensure that they are a little bit less trade diverting and remain a stepping stone for multilateralism, in the same regards with regard to plurilateral agreements. And for the EU, I have a big wish that we do not only focus on the defensive side of trade, not only talk about anti-dumping measures, anti-countervailing measures, enforcement regulation, but that we think more about the EU as a proactive actor in global governance, which also means that we do have to do our homework with regard to a consistent trade policy, especially vis-a-vis China, but also vis-a-vis free trade agreements. Only this way we will be able to really shape globalization. And I stop here. Thank you so much.
Patrick, your mic is muted. Patrick, your mic is muted.
I was trying to unmute it with the thing, which normally works. Well, thank you very much, Stormy. You've been very economical with your time allocation, but you've also been rather, how can I put it, pressing. So I reckon that you talked about a glass being half full or half empty. I think for you this glass is 2/3 empty. Yeah?
I wish it wasn't, because I put so much stake in the WTO. And really, what I believe is, if there's political will, there is a way. I think it's not the institutions which are a problem here. It's us. It's policymakers and the lack of political will. And that's what we have to get back. And then I would say, oh, we could reach a full glass very quickly.
Good. All right. Before I give the floor to Peter Draper, I just wanted to remind the attendees that they are most welcome to ask questions. I think it's via the chat box, if I'm not mistaken. So please feel free to do that, and we'll take as many as we can at the end. And with that, over to you, Peter.
Well, thanks, Patrick. I'm going to attempt to share a presentation. The first part of which agrees with everything that Stormy has said, so I'm just going to skip right over it because I really don't have anything new to add. But I thought it's important to just remind ourselves where we are in terms of the global protectionist stakes and the incidence of protectionism. So on the left-hand side of this panel, this is taken from the Global Trade Alert, which I think everybody on this panel knows very well. In 2009, at the height of the global financial crisis, the incidence of protectionism was relatively low. Where we are now in 2020 is in a very bad situation, and the curve is getting worse by the day. So it's important to start from that perspective. I then thought it would be useful to just reflect where we are in the WTO reform process, because the G20 heads of state have agreed that the WTO needs to be reformed. They agreed that some time ago, but beyond paying lip service to it, not much has been done. And what we've seen is the incidence of protectionism, particularly amongst the G20 states, has escalated sharply. So they're not practicing what they preach. But basically, even before COVID-19, WTO reform, I think, was baffling, very confusing. Multilateral accords had already stalled. There wasn't much new on the table. Even fisheries subsidies, which should be relatively simple, has not moved much, and the prospects do not look particularly good. We have seen some signs of life, so there's my optimism, Patrick, particularly in the joint statement initiatives and especially the e-commerce talks, although I think they're a misnomer. They really are about digital trade rules. But there are lots of problems in those talks, as we all know, because of very different philosophical approaches amongst the majors as to how digital trade should be governed. Now, there's a lot of complexity in the WTO reform process. I want to focus on three that I think are particularly important, of which I'm going to discuss, well, one in particular, and then add another one later on, which has become more immediate. So the first is special and differential treatment for developing countries. I think this is one of the fundamental divides in the WTO. And it's really about the future of accommodating developing countries in the system, with very different divides on this question. And it's not obvious how this gets resolved. And we could go on for a long time about this. I have a separate presentation on it, and I know, Patrick, you've written a very interesting paper on this as well, but I think it is a central issue going forward. It's related to some extent to the second one, which is the challenge, I guess, of accommodating or not state capitalism or different versions of state capitalism in the WTO. And this really goes to the heart of the US-China trade conflict. And that revolves not only, but increasingly, I would argue, around the issue of industrial subsidies and their connection to state-owned enterprises, and particularly in the Chinese context. I would just add an important footnote here that post-COVID-19, with the amount of money that's being sprayed at economies all over the world, and particularly in the G20 economies, it's not obvious to me anymore who's a market economy and who is not. And so quite how we sort all of that out beyond the COVID pandemic is a very interesting question to which I think nobody has answers currently. Now, I think the issue of decision-making remains a critical one, and especially the balance between consensus decision-making versus critical mass decision-making. And as we know, this is also to some extent connected to the special and differential treatment problem. So some countries want to move ahead, particularly developed countries, forge new rules and disciplines. Many countries are unhappy that the Doha round was not concluded, and a whole range of issues were left off the table, such as agriculture, to take one obvious but important example. So how do we solve these issues? Is it dead, effectively? Is plurilateralism the only route on the table? It's not obvious at this point, I would argue. Patrick already mentioned the freeze on the appellate body. That remains, in some senses, existential. The bottom line is that the members are sharply divided and progress is very challenging, and it's made more challenging by COVID-19. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the problem of export controls, which I've been doing a bit of work on recently. And it gets to the issues that Stormy was raising in her questions, to some extent, particularly the state market question. And I'll skip over the detail on this. It's very small, and particularly the panel on the left. The key point really is that member states in the WTO are relatively free to impose export taxes and licenses. And hence we see a range of export controls mushrooming across the developed world in particular, but not only the developed world. Quantitative restrictions are in theory banned, but in practice there's a range of exceptions. So it's still possible to impose them. Returning to the right-hand side, what's really concerning and what's fueling this is the geopolitical context, is the increasing recourse to national security as a justification, not just for export restrictions, but particularly export restrictions. What makes this more and more concerning is that the conception of national security is very fluid and becoming more and more fluid by the day. So I think we could all agree that military security or hard security is an accepted definition, but there's a whole range of others out there, from soft security, societal security. If we're thinking about food security, for instance, that goes to the fabric of society if it doesn't have food available. And I think these issues are increasingly focusing on three sectors. So the military, which has been there for a long time, and defense-related industries, hence dual-use controls, export controls, which Stormy already mentioned. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, health security has really moved into the frame in a big way, and we saw a range of export controls being imposed. And of course, food security, which this time around has not got out of hand, but back in 2007, 2008, became a very serious problem for the global food system, with food prices escalating rapidly as more and more states imposed export restrictions. And we're even now seeing export controls extending into services, and particularly now to algorithms, as we saw in the case of ByteDance and the Chinese government imposing an export control on that company's algorithm. We're seeing it mushroom into different areas, such as the growth of minilateral cooperation, so small group cooperation, particularly amongst, for example, Japan, Australia, and India. And this is about supply chain security, so the issues around value chains that Stormy was mentioning, but taking it into a security context. And in that particular case, they're looking to secure supplies of critical raw materials and divert exports to each other. So in a sense, that's also an export restriction. And what is interesting about all this is that for export restrictions, countries don't need to resort to the GATT Article 21 national security exceptions, largely because they're free to impose taxes, licenses, etc. So the pitch I'm making is that export controls is an area that really needs to be regulated much more strongly. Of course, in our geopolitical environment, that's very difficult to do, and increasingly difficult to do. On the left-hand side is really a mind map for why we need to regulate export controls much more closely. And this goes to Stormy's questions, in essence. So if we start at the top, what we're seeing going on in the global political economy is more and more disintegration, the forces of disintegration gathering pace, I would argue. I think that promotes a less secure global environment. It also has serious systemic economic impacts, so it raises food prices, for instance, the export control instrument at a multilateral level. But because these effects are taking place, countries are more and more predisposed to make use of strategic industrial and trade policies. So that it becomes self-perpetuating. Now, the problem is you can't get a remedy in the WTO, what Mark Wu at Harvard refers to as the remedy gaps. The breaches are not being solved there, partly because the appellate body is seized. And taking all that into account, the prospects for WTO reforms are decreasing. And because they're decreasing, that promotes the disintegration cycle. And the real question is, what can G20 governments do to arrest the slide and reverse it? And I don't necessarily have an answer to that question, but it does require engaging these issues head on and having a reform conversation about, in a sense, unilateral disarmament, use of this particular instrument. We see similar things going on with subsidies. This was the subject of one of the Think 20 policy briefs that I think I circulated earlier. So a few quick thoughts on that. Here we did make specific recommendations for what the G20 should do, in our view. And the first is to get serious about subsidies reform, but this can't just be left to trade officials. If it is left to trade officials, I would predict that nothing will happen. So I think finance ministry officials need to be brought into the conversation because subsidies at the end of the day are on the one hand about money, and that involves finance, obviously, but on the other hand, finance ministry officials tend to have an economy-wide perspective, as opposed to trade ministry officials who tend to respond to particular interest groups in society. So if the G20 can do this, it needs to have a fairly broad scope. There's many different kinds of subsidies, lots of reform issues on the table. It can't necessarily just be confined to industrial subsidies, for instance. It should incorporate agricultural subsidies and maybe export controls, export subsidies, etc. You need to take this conversation to Geneva, so mirror it through meeting or parallel structures amongst Geneva-based diplomats. That will also link it to the broader WTO reform discussions taking place in Geneva. But as we know, there's very little progress in the Geneva context, and hence the importance of an outside set of actors, in this case the G20, giving Geneva a steer, but it can't just be a G20 process. In our brief, we set out a range of principles to guide the subsidies reform discussion in the G20. So I'll just list these, I won't go through them. So focus on major negative cross-border spillover effects, but allow subsidies with legitimate social and policy objectives. Some subsidies are legitimate, obviously. Embed the principle of competitive neutrality. That first needs to be accepted, of course. I think China has quite an evolving view on this principle. So China refers, for instance, to ownership neutrality as opposed to competitive neutrality. So we need to agree on first principles in this context. G20 members should agree to discipline and cap the growth of subsidies and review them periodically to further reduce them. If possible, there should be some consensus on special and differential treatment. So how would developing countries be treated within these principles? And then also very important to tighten the disciplines on recourse to trade remedies, which is a core Chinese concern, for instance, because they argue, maybe fairly in some instances, that they are being unfairly targeted by trade remedies instruments. So at the very least, there needs to be a discussion about that. So what would be on the table? A range of sectors that are subject to cross-border spillovers, big negative cross-border spillovers. Also the kinds of subsidies that are paid. Subsidies take many different forms. Currently they're regulated, as we know, by the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. So those definitions in the agreement need to be revisited, refreshed, updated. But that requires also measuring the stock of subsidies. And here we have a big problem because nobody knows what the stock of subsidies, particularly industrial subsidies, is. We have more precision on the agricultural subsidy side, but very little precision on the industrial subsidy side. So who's going to come up with these measures? Probably it's going to be the multilateral institutions, and the World Bank has already started a project on this. That needs to be strengthened and deepened. The OECD also has a lot to contribute in this space, although they've really gone the value chain by value chain route as opposed to taking a broader view. And then, of course, everyone needs to commit to full transparency in the notification of their subsidies to the WTO. Otherwise, we're wasting our time and we won't be able to measure it. So thinking back on the pre-COVID phase, reform of subsidies regimes was already difficult. Where we are now is it's become much more difficult because of all the money being paid to a whole range of domestic producers in all G20 economies. But narrowly focusing on industrial subsidies, it's not going to be enough to come up with a deal, in our view. The scope needs to be broadened. We need to increase the scope for trade-offs through a broader reform package. But we've got to be careful that we don't end up mirroring the Doha round, because the Doha round failed. So this cannot be a single undertaking exercise. But what is the optimum package for the maximum number of players that would make this meaningful? That's an important question that I don't have the answer for right now. And then a final slide, just widening the ambit a little bit further, but drawing on what I've already got on the table. I do think we need a combination of plurilateral negotiations and multilateral negotiations. So on the plurilateral side, we already have a pharmaceutical trade agreement under the aegis of the WTO. There's some proposals to widen and deepen that, particularly tariff reductions, and to lock those in. And I think that needs to get engaged as quickly as possible. That would send a very powerful signal to the rest of the world that the WTO is back in business, and it can come up with meaningful arrangements that address, in this case, the pandemic. But at the same time, we really need to clarify what we mean by essential goods and services. And a lot of the incidence of COVID-19 measures has fallen on the services side. So that very much needs to be part of the discussion. I've already mentioned the importance of the subsidies package. In all of these plurilateral negotiations or proposed plurilaterals, G20 members are central to each of them. And then on the multilateral side, the conditions under which the security exceptions clauses could be accessed need to be tightened, but just not only the security exceptions clauses, but also export restrictions. And so that whole conceptualization and regulation of national security under the aegis of the WTO does need to be revisited, difficult as it is. And then finally, special and differential treatment. I believe that some kind of graduation criteria is the inevitable route to go for the WTO. It's not going to happen probably in my lifetime, but I do think the conversation needs to be engaged and taken seriously. Otherwise, I suspect we're probably not going to get anywhere. And this is probably my most controversial proposal, but I think it's an important point that we need to engage. But if we are going to engage, we have to tighten the links to aid for trade provision. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And we already have some technology around this, particularly the trade facilitation agreement. And I'll end there, Patrick. I think you're muted, Patrick.
Yeah, something wrong with it takes too long to mute. I have to press it 3 times, then it unmutes. Peter, thank you very much for your extensive depressing list. There are quite interesting issues. So an incoming Director General at the WTO, is this Director General, she, going to prioritize, sequence this reform project? I mean, is it big bites, little bites? Seems to me that it's, how do you start? You know, the WTO in the last 7 years has been pretty moribund. There hasn't been much leadership. So the question really is, how do you start the process and get traction? I'll leave that for the audience to quiz you on, and move on to Professor Hoda. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm grateful to the speakers before me for covering a very large canvas. And I think I will concentrate only on some issues because they have made it so much easier for me to do that. When we think of issues in trade and investment, the issues that come to mind first are those that are causing trade friction amongst the big nations. The most prominent of the issues at the root of trade conflict are industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, use of security exception for protection of specific industries, and infringement of intellectual property rights. But when we look at the records of G20 meetings last year, we find that the attention of G20 leaders is focused or was focused not on these specific issues, but on the overall WTO framework, both in the statement of trade ministers at Tsukuba and the summit declaration of Osaka. There was emphasis on the necessary reform of the World Trade Organization in order to improve its functioning. Ministers of G20 had vowed to work constructively in the lead up to the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. Unfortunately, the Ministerial Conference has had to be postponed, and there has been little progress in the talks at Geneva on the issues that have been raised. These issues relate to the three functions of the WTO, namely negotiations, monitoring, and dispute settlement. and other speakers have already covered some of the aspects. There's another issue, live issue, and Peter Draper spoke on it just now, which is also a framework issue, namely special and differential treatment of developing countries. In my remarks today, I intend to dwell on these framework issues of the WTO, relating to the WTO. The most important by far of these issues today is that of the WTO dispute settlement system, which is broken. The distinguishing features of the WTO dispute settlement system as originally implemented are that the process is adjudicatory in nature, automatic and binding. This contrasted with the process in the GATT days, when dispute settlement was essentially an exercise in diplomacy, and at every step it needed consensus to make progress. Another feature of the dispute settlement system is a two-tier system with a provision for appeal on the findings and recommendations of the panel. The appellate body has a pivotal role, and its recommendations and rulings are final and binding. Because of blockage of appointments of members of the appellate body, it is no longer functional. Dispute settlement in the WTO is virtually back to the GATT days. The party that wins a case still has to negotiate compliance with the losing party. Without the appellate body, the dispute settlement procedures will be neither automatic nor binding. As a consequence, there's a great danger of the outcome being guided by power play rather than by the rules and by considerations of equity and fairness. The multilateral trading system embodied in the WTO agreement stands gravely weakened. In search of a solution, the EU and 18 other members have established the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, the MPIA, which will remain operational only as long as the appellate body continues to be in abeyance. The establishment of the MPIA has sent a signal on the determination of these parties, of the parties to the agreement, to keep alive the two-step adjudication system created by the WTO agreement. But a number of important trading nations have not shown an inclination to join it. Eventually, there seems to be no option but to deal with the United States and its criticism of the functioning of the appellate body. The draft decision prepared by the former chair of the dispute settlement body deals adequately with most of the points of US criticism, and which is already before the General Council. The difficulty is that the US has not shown a willingness so far to engage in negotiations to resolve the matter. This may be because the draft does not appear to address adequately the most important criticism of persistent overreaching and erroneous decisions by the appellate body. Where the appellate body has erred in interpreting a provision, the solution lies already in obtaining an authoritative interpretation from the General Council. The Marrakesh Agreement already provides for procedures for the adoption of an authoritative interpretation by 3/4 majority of the members. The process could, however, get complicated if any member insists on the decision to be adopted by consensus. And this has happened once when a proposal was made for an authoritative interpretation. To simplify matters, and this is my suggestion, a simplistic one, if I may say, the General Council could decide that when requests are made for an authoritative interpretation and there is no consensus at the first meeting, the matter shall be put to vote. In this manner, it may be possible to overturn the appellate body rulings, at least on some of the findings which have been widely criticized, not only by the United States, but by the academia and by other members. Simplified procedures for authoritative interpretation could be added to the action points in the draft decision for the General Council. Unfortunately, the position that was reflected in the deliberations of the Geneva Trade Week in the last week of September, in which I think both Patrick and Stormy participated, does not give us any cause for optimism. The US is proposing a single stage process for dispute resolution, doing away with the appellate stage, while a large number of members wish to continue with the two-tier system. Of course, this two-tier is also proposed in the MPIA, to which I have just referred. Well, more than this, I cannot say anything on the dispute settlement machinery, what is to be done. Let me turn to the other three issues. One other issue, which is equally important, is the fact that ever since the WTO was established, the liberalization of trade through multilateral trade negotiations has been virtually at standstill. However, there has been success in plurilateral negotiations on market access, both in goods and services. And therein lies some hope. In these agreements, a subset of members accounting for a large proportion of world trade, which they deemed to be constituting a critical mass, decided to go ahead with plurilateral agreements for the liberalization of trade on MFN basis. We have had the Information Technology Agreement, the Agreement on Expansion of Trade in Information Technology Products, the Protocol on Telecommunication Services, and 2 protocols on financial services. The conclusion of agreements in these areas shows that open plurilateral agreements hold great promise to provide the route to multilateral liberalization in both goods and services. An encouraging aspect is that in such agreements, it's also possible to add commitments on regulatory matters in the area of services and on non-tariff measures in goods. While no decision has been taken to allow plurilateral negotiations to proceed within the WTO on any subject, important groups of members are already going ahead on e-commerce and domestic regulations in the area of services, technically outside the WTO. Things may evolve in future in the WTO in favor of plurilateral negotiations in new areas. But in order to unlock the possibilities, it would be appropriate for members, the full membership, to declare their openness to such agreements, subject to the condition of MFN and some other conditions. Now turn to the third issue, which is of improved transparency and better compliance with notification obligation. Without doubt, Transparency is one of the important obligations of the WTO agreement. And unless individual members comply with their notification requirements, obligations, other members cannot keep track of substantive compliance of the rules by them. What all WTO members need to be kept under pressure to comply with notification obligations. The punitive approach suggested by the EU, Japan, and US, including a supplement on the normal assessed contribution, in my opinion, goes a bit too far. Overall, the situation of compliance with notification obligation cannot be said to be satisfactory. But the main problem is in respect of members with a serious constraint on human resources, such as the least developed countries, island developing countries, and the sub-Saharan African countries. Many of them have missions in Geneva with only 1 or 2 diplomats handling multiple international organizations. And a number of them don't even have Geneva-based missions. Even in the capitals, there are only 1 or 2 officials in the Foreign Affairs Ministry responsible for all international organizations. The meager staff find it difficult to follow day-to-day developments in various bodies of the WTO, and submitting all the required notifications is extremely difficult for them to handle. The suggestion made by the EU, Japan, and US, and a couple of other members, is to follow a punitive approach, compel compliance, and to use sanctions against members defaulting in notifications. This is not a suggestion that is likely to succeed. In fact, given the lack of harmonious relations prevailing among delegations in Geneva in recent years, it may worsen matters. Neither is it reasonable to go to the other extreme and propose a general relaxation of notification obligations for developing countries by way of a special and differential treatment for all developing. LDCs and other small economies which have a human resources problem and a huge capacity constraint may, however, deserve a lightening of administrative burden of periodic notifications. For these members, it will help if the frequency of notifications is reduced, as has already been done by requiring the least developed countries to submit certain notifications in the area of agriculture in alternate years instead of every year. For other developing countries, all that may be necessary is a heightened degree of polite peer pressure and finger pointing. Thus, I'm advocating a twofold approach to be followed for improving compliance with notification obligation. For LDCs, island developing countries, and other members with limited administrative infrastructure, the frequency of notification should be generally reduced to, say, once in 5 years. For other developing countries, peer pressure, continued peer pressure, is the only way to induce compliance. I come to the last issue on which I wish to speak today, and that is the special and differential treatment of developing countries. Now, this issue has become quite controversial, but I really do not understand why this is so, because the economic impact of the special and differential treatment measures in the WTO agreement is not really that much. They think of China and China's growth, impressive growth and development. And they think that this is all due to a special and differential treatment. But my own analysis shows that China's rise has had nothing to do with a special and differential treatment. They have, without the help of a special and differential treatment, become a formidable power. The main argument put forward by the US in making its proposal for graduation is that since a number of developing countries have made great strides in development, it would not be rational to continue to put all of them in an undifferentiated group. The logic of this argument is difficult to contest. But the US has put forward the proposal that in the current and future negotiations, 4 categories of WTO members must be denied SNDT. Those that are members of the OECD or an applicant for its membership, those that are members of G20, those that are classified as a high-income country by the World Bank, and those that have a share of no less than 0.5% in global merchandise trade. Well, I said that the logic of the argument that all developing countries should not be put in one bracket is absolutely uncontestable. But the point to ponder is, looking at the WTO, looking at the US proposals, how do we determine the level at which the member may be deemed to have lost its developing country status for the purposes of the WTO rules? Here I have a suggestion. When Part 4 was added to GATT, the main concern was the low standard of living in developing countries. And it was on the basis of this that they were regarded as a class apart, the low standard of living. It follows that any change in the development status of a WTO member can be only on the basis of a rise in the standard of living. Of the 4 alternatives proposed by the USA, clearly a rise in the share of world merchandise trade is not an appropriate measure, as it does not take into account the standard of living. The same argument applies to the membership of the G20. The G20 is a political grouping and not one based on the standard of living. The suggestions to treat members that have been classified by the World Bank as high-income countries or that have joined OECD as developed countries are more logical, as both the groupings can be associated with the high development status. I come back to the point that I made just now, that how important are the provisions relating to special and differential treatment on which there is so much concern. I can say that the most important provision is that which says something about less than full reciprocity in negotiations, tariff negotiations. Now, less than full reciprocity does not, the concept does not spell out what is less than full. And in the negotiations, it is perfectly within control of the developed countries to decide at what level they should accept the level of concessions that should be given by the developing countries. I do not see any difficulty in implementing this. During the Doha round discussions, for instance, the negotiations could not come to a conclusion. What the developing countries want is not that there should be automaticity in giving them and granting them less than full reciprocity. What they want is that there should be some, the requirement from them should be a little less. How much less? Well, that is for the trading partners to decide, and they can be in full control of the negotiation. Anyway, I think the proposal for graduation, which has not been accepted by the developing countries so far, is something that should be accepted by them, because you cannot have a situation in which fully developed countries, such as South Korea or Singapore, continue to be treated as developing countries. I think I'll end my remarks here, because I think time is over for me. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Anwarul, for that very interesting set of proposals. You can't have an interesting proposal without it being highly controversial. But in any case, it's time now for audience questions. We're not doing at all well on that. We've really only got a couple of questions here, which we should probably take first, and then if no more questions come, we can have a discussion on some of these other things that have come up in the discussions amongst the panelists. The questions that I have here are to do with the value chains, flexibility and resilience, and the question of strategic decoupling. That is part of the question. The other part is, can flexible supply chains also promote a greener post-COVID global economy? So I think these are obvious questions for Stormy.
Okay. While I would also be very interested hearing others on the question of value chains. First of all, I don't believe that decoupling as proposed by the Trump administration would ever work. The markets are way too integrated, and the Chinese market is way too important also to the US economy, although there is obviously a huge difference in interdependence between the German economy and the Chinese economy, and the US economy and the Chinese economy. But still, it's for investment, for production, for sourcing, and so on. And it's just, it's too much of an important market to completely decouple. Do I still believe we need to check for vulnerabilities in our value chains? Absolutely. And this is, big companies have been doing this. They have always looked for political risks. They certainly have learned their lessons with regard to environmental risks, natural catastrophes. We have seen the disruptions of value chains after the tsunami and the nuclear disaster in Japan, what that did, for example, for value chains in the car industry. We also see the disruptions with regard to hurricanes and the Caribbean states, and especially some German pharmaceutical companies were hit hard by this. So yes, absolutely. Companies need to evaluate their value chains and build in redundancies and diversify. Does that mean that all production should come back to Europe? No, certainly not. I mean, I'm a strong believer in comparative and competitive advantages, and realizing economies of scale and also product differentiation and so on. And I think that integration in world markets and globalization has helped billions, millions of people to get out of poverty and has really fostered global economic growth and prosperity. So no, nationalization and regionalization of value chains is not the answer. Plus, I also believe if you do that, then vulnerabilities won't be reduced, because if you then have a shock to your system and you're sourcing everything from your neighbors, the likelihood is very high that they will also be affected by whatever happens. So yes, analyzing value chains, absolutely, but no decoupling as in Trump's view. And could this be used for a greener economy? In the last financial economic crisis, I think, I believe that we saw that the stimulus packages were very much geared towards green growth. And I would almost say building back better, the slogan of the current Biden team, but also, I mean, more than in the US. But if I'm now looking at stimulus packages, I don't see that as strongly, especially not in the United States, that this has really been used to restructure your economies. So I'm a little bit pessimistic here, how we are using the stimulus money. With regard to trade, the members of my organization, of BDI, have been a little bit skeptical with regard to the environmental goods agreement as a way to liberalize trade in green goods. And the reason for this is that it's so hard to define what a green good is, and it would be inherently discriminatory. And where do you draw the line between very similar chemical components, for example? One would be categorized as green, the other not. It would be really very, very tricky. On the other hand, if you find a technological solution for this and a clear classification and have it as broad as possible, then it could be a step to liberalize trade in green goods and make it easier to trade them. The same with regard to health products. I forgot who mentioned it now, but there is already a plurilateral agreement on pharmaceuticals. It's pretty much stuck, and it reflects, ages ago, the status ages ago. So it's really not up to date. But if we took that as the basis for a plurilateral agreement with a wide coverage of products, so make it as undiscriminatory as possible, and start maybe with the G20 countries, then that again could be a good step to further liberalize trade and products where we really need to have a wider access to globally. And it really comes down again to the political will to do so, because the ideas are on the table. And certainly the best way would be to do it on an MFN basis. If that is not achievable, because I know that many countries are more, they fear that there would be free riders, then it needs to be not on an MFN basis as the first step, but with a goal to really multilateralize and MFNize it at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Stormy. We have another couple of interesting questions here. One about special and differential treatment and the idea of graduation. Of course, we could discuss whether graduation is what the solution really is to dealing with differentiation, but assuming that it is, and that you are either one or the other, and we're in a binary world, what about the idea that income, per capita income, not so much as an average, but rather as a median or something like that, which could be an indicator of a standard of living. Do you think that that could be a part of a solution if we are going to go down the binary road of saying you're either one or the other? Professor Hoda.
Well, in the subsidies agreement, there was a special and differential treatment provided in respect of export subsidies. A number of low-income countries who were listed in the agreement were just sort of not burdened with that obligation. But there is also a provision on, already a provision on graduation, that the moment the per capita income of those countries rose above $1,000, they would be graduated. And that is what has happened. And this is real terms, as on in 1991, $1,000 US dollar, as in on the value of the 1991 dollar. Now, so under this, every year, the per capita income of the beneficiaries is examined, and India has been excluded, has been graduated out, I think about 5 years back. So there is a provision already on that, on graduation.
Yeah, can I just say one thing and then ask Peter to give a response? The question really isn't about using the criterion of per capita, it's about using the criterion of median per capita income, because you can have a high per capita income with a lot of very poor people in dire circumstances if you take the average. If you take the median, you get a better idea of what the level of the well-being of the population is in a more general sense. Peter, since you're in favor of graduation and a binary approach, do you think that this is a way to go?
I think there's a number of different measures that could and should be looked at. And part of the problem is that different groups put forward different measures because they define development differently. So why not, for instance, the Human Development Index, which strikes me as a better potential basis because it's trying to measure development, whereas per capita income is really about the income distribution, which is one dimension of development. It's not as all-encompassing as the HDI. But the HDI is not a perfect measure either. What I would really like to do, Patrick, is get a group of smart economists like yourself to really analyze this, but using the frame, well, what do we mean by development anyway? For example, in the United States, I think you could make a case for some kind of limited special and differential treatment if one thinks of all those poor people in the Midwest, for example. So who is President Trump's base? Why did they vote for him? They think trade hasn't worked for them. These are uneducated people primarily, often very poor. They've been stuck on the low end of the wage distribution for a long time. In some senses, they're structurally underdeveloped. And that's largely the white part of President Trump's base. That's before you go into the black population in the United States, where there's structural underdevelopment that's gone on for decades, if not centuries. But if you just look at the United States as a whole and focus on per capita income as your measure, obviously you're going to say, well, the United States has put, as the US ambassador to the WTO had said about China, they've put a man on the moon. So how can they be underdeveloped? And that's probably true. So I think we need to rethink this whole concept.
Be careful.
Of development. Yeah.
Talk about men on the moon. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you to be brief. We've got a couple more questions. One is on Huawei. Is Huawei a phenomenon that is going to have to be addressed as a continuing trend in the way that the multilateral trading system deals with cooperation around high-tech and high-tech issues? Is it a storm in a teacup, or is it a foretaste of a fundamental problem over decoupling of technological cooperation between the big players who are the tech giants of today? Who would like to take a shot at that? Stormy? Is that okay? Go ahead, Peter. Be brief, please. Be brief. We've got little time.
Yeah, I think it's one of those dual-use technology areas that goes to the strategic decoupling story. So underlying it is the geopolitical contest between the US and China, and the US being very concerned that by exporting its advanced technology to China, they're enabling the Chinese military, which is engaging in expansionist behavior, whether it's on the border with India or in the South China Sea. Of course, the Chinese have a counter argument, and we could go into that, but you asked me to be brief. I think it really is a strategic decoupling in a technological sense.
From which, no doubt, both sides would lose if that were to be the outcome. Stormy.
I very much agree. It's a phenomenon, but the underlying reasons go so much deeper. I mean, it's a competition of different systems, right? And it's also a competition for geopolitical influence and spheres. And I don't expect that to disappear. But no matter who is going to stay or move into the White House later this year, I think that this underlying reasons for the technological competition and the conflicts that's going to stay.
Okay, we have another question here. How does one blend plurilateral agreements with a single undertaking, both of which have been suggested by panelists? Are these compatible? And I would add another consideration here, which is, Professor Hoda, you said that somewhere along the line with the plurilateral or one of these joint statement initiative approaches, you would have to have a consensus decision to adopt them. That is actually contested, because there are those who believe that these things can be scheduled as long as they are not discriminatory, they don't infringe MFN. So I think these are a couple of questions. They're kind of linked. How do you square single undertaking with plurilateral? Unless, of course, you insist that there must be a plurilateral decision for adoption somewhere along the line, and all you've really achieved is a rebalancing of rights and obligations via the plurilateral without taking rights away from anybody. Who would like to have a first shot at that? Okay, Anwarul, I can see you got an answer there.
I have a question on your single undertaking. Which single undertaking are you referring to? There's no single undertaking at present in any negotiations that are going on. There was a single undertaking at the time of the Uruguay round. There was also a single undertaking in the Doha round. But the plurilateral negotiations that have been sort of put in motion, there is no single undertaking there.
Yeah.
But a single undertaking is a double-edged sword. You know, it helps to obtain parallel movement on a number of subjects which are of interest to different groups of people. But it also leads to retarding the progress in some areas which are promising when some areas that are difficult do not achieve any progress.
Well, my view on the single undertaking is that the first single undertaking came from the Uruguay round, and what it was intended to do was to make quite sure that the stronger countries, the larger countries, didn't cut the deals that interested them and then neglect the rest. So everything would be held until everything was agreed. That changed completely at the end of the Uruguay round. Single undertaking took on an entirely different meaning. What it became was either you accept the whole thing or forget it. Completely different change in emphasis. But I do take your point that the single undertaking in the question is not really where the issue is, but there is still the matter of whether or not you need a consensus decision to progress work in the WTO. because a lot of people who are involved in the joint statement initiatives believe that the problem with consensus is that it's turned into veto. Peter, you have a shot first before, just tell us what you think about this, and then we'll come back to you, Anwarul.
So to the question, I think it's a great question. I'm toying with the notion of a plurilateral of plurilaterals, which is a tantalizing notion, but I haven't given it any flesh yet. But basically, I think you want enough countries with enough on the table to be able to construct a meaningful consensus of sorts, a plurilateral of plurilaterals. So for example, I don't think you can get agreement on industrial subsidies without something on agricultural subsidies, never mind other issues. But what's that sufficient core of plurilateral negotiations that makes for an overarching package that doesn't get you back to the Doha round with all of its failures? That's the question, and I don't know what the answer is.
Professor Hoda, can you answer in 2 minutes? We've only got 5 minutes left.
Well, are you referring to me?
Yeah.
The consensus requirement has been carried to an extreme. I think there is a sense in requiring consensus as far as substantive obligations are concerned. That is, you shouldn't be imposing substantive obligations on individual members without their consent. But to go to the extreme of requiring consensus on procedural matters also, I think is not the right thing to do. For instance, the WTO agreement specifically, the Marrakesh agreement specifically allows agreement on the basis of 2/3 majority in the case of accessions. It allows agreement, the adoption of authoritative interpretation on the basis of 3/4 of the members. But still, there is an insistence that you should first try for consensus. And when do you stop trying for consensus and proceed to the next step of voting? That is not very clear. So by this method, they stop action on virtually everything. You cannot have an authoritative interpretation because they say that first try for consensus. When do you stop trying? I think that is why what I mentioned in my intervention is that for remedying the errors that have been made by the appellate body, we should really take a recourse to authoritative interpretation. And having regard to the criticism that has been made of some of the decisions, I think a lot of decisions, a lot of their, at least a number of them, such as the one that relates to public bodies, the one that relates to a safeguards agreement, I think they can be set aside through authoritative interpretations, and that should satisfy the United States and that should satisfy others also. So I think this taking consensus requirement to the extreme on procedural matters, so much so that even when it is allowed to have voting, you try first for consensus. I think that is not good for the functioning of the WTO.
Yeah, I think the way around this would have been for, you can actually schedule things. You don't need other countries to ask permission to schedule. But anyhow, we have come to the end of the, I'll give the last word to Stormy. Have you got anything you want to say? And then I think we're going to have to end because it's 1 minute to termination time.
I agree with both of our honorable panelists. I think that if we stick completely to consensus, and we make MFN a requirement for plurilateral market access agreement, we're just not going to see any plurilateral agreements. And if we believe that plurilateral agreements are the way out of the WTO crisis, we have either to accept that in parts they are not MFN based, or we have to get at the consensus principle also. You're shaking your head, Patrick.
Only to humbly point out that if you tried to go for non-MFN without an explicit agreement to that effect, which I think is exceedingly hard to imagine in any world, you just go straight to dispute. It just doesn't work, which is why.
But market access without a critical mass of countries, you just won't see that, because I mean, most bigger countries, advanced countries, they just don't like free riding. So maybe we have to start with not market access plurilaterals, but with rules plurilaterals, as the 4 which are currently discussed in the initiatives. I think that's probably an easier way forward than really to get into the market access.
Probably true, because free riding on rules is quite difficult, since when you put your rules in, they tend to be MFN anyway. Anyhow, we really have to stop. If we, otherwise we're going to get into trouble for overshooting. We've overshot by 1 minute. I'd just like to thank all the panelists very much indeed for their contributions, and Rajat for his patience. Listening to us all this time, plus everybody else, of course, who's been listening. And thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Peter, Stormy, Professor Hoda. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.